The orange SUV pulled away from the Ashford Industries tower and merged into Boston traffic. In the back seat, CEO Claire Ashford stared at the contract in her trembling hands. A red stamp stretched across the final page. Cancelled. $9 million gone in less than 15 minutes. The biggest deal of her career had just collapsed. She pressed the phone to her ear, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What do you mean the Takahashi contract is cancelled?" The answer on the other end made her blood run cold. In the driver's seat, John Bennett tightened his grip on the wheel but said nothing. To Claire, he was just another hired driver. Quiet, ordinary, forgettable. But what she didn't know was this. The man behind the wheel already knew exactly why the deal had been destroyed. Even more shocking, he was the only person in Boston who could still save it. Within the next 24 hours, a hidden betrayal worth millions would be exposed. A powerful executive would lose everything, and a secret that had been buried for 8 years would change both of their lives forever. Before we continue, tell us in the comments. If you lost everything you worked for in a single day, would you give up or fight back? And if you enjoy inspiring stories of courage, justice, and second chances, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. The morning sun rose over Boston Harbor, painting the skyline in shades of gold and silver. Inside a modest apartment in Quincy, however, the day began much like every other day for John Bennett, quietly. No luxury penthouse, no executive office, no assistants waiting for instructions, just a small kitchen filled with the smell of toast and eggs. John stood at the stove while his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, sat at the table swinging her feet beneath her chair. Her school backpack rested beside her, covered in colorful stickers and tiny drawings she had made herself. "Dad, do you think Mom can still see us?" Sophie suddenly asked. The question caught him off guard. It had been 4 years since his wife passed away after a long battle with illness, yet some mornings the pain still felt fresh. John forced a gentle smile. "I think she can," he replied softly. Sophie nodded, as if that answer was enough. Then she pulled out a folded sheet of paper and handed it to him. "I made another drawing." John unfolded it carefully. There he was, standing beside Sophie, holding her hand. Above them floated a smiling woman surrounded by clouds. The same drawing Sophie made almost every week, her mother watching over them. For a moment, John couldn't speak. Instead, he folded the picture and slipped it into his wallet, beside dozens of other drawings he had saved over the years. To anyone else, they were simple sketches. To him, they were priceless treasures. A short time later, after dropping Sophie off at school, John drove toward work. For the past 8 years, he'd worked as a professional driver for Elite Drive Services. His life followed a simple routine: drive clients, pick up Sophie, cook dinner, help with homework, start over the next day. Most people who met him assumed he had always been a driver. They saw the plain jacket, the aging sedan, the quiet personality. Nothing about him suggested success, power, or influence, and John preferred it that way. The less attention people paid to him, the easier life became. What no one knew was that behind those calm eyes lived a man carrying secrets large enough to change entire companies. Secrets he had buried years ago, secrets he never intended to reveal. That morning, as he arrived at Elite Drive headquarters, his manager handed him a new assignment. "VIP client," the manager said. "Who?" "Claire Ashford." The name immediately caught his attention. Ashford Industries was one of the most respected steel companies in America. Its young CEO had built a reputation for being brilliant, demanding, and nearly impossible to impress. John simply nodded and accepted the route. To him, it was just another job, another passenger, another day. Or so he thought, because within a matter of hours, he would find himself at the center of a corporate crisis worth $9 million. A crisis involving betrayal, greed, and a contract that someone desperately wanted destroyed. And before it was over, the quiet driver everyone overlooked would be forced to confront a past he had spent 8 years trying to leave behind. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Now, let's continue and discover how a single father working as a driver became the one person capable of saving a $9 million deal and changing the future of an entire company. At exactly 11 o'clock, John Bennett guided the black SUV toward the entrance of Ashford Industries Tower. The building dominated the financial district like a monument to power. Glass, steel, money. Hundreds of employees moved through its revolving doors every hour, each one contributing to the machine that Claire Ashford controlled. John parked at the curb and stepped out. A moment later, the main entrance opened. Claire Ashford emerged. She moved quickly, her eyes fixed on the phone in her hand. Her dark business suit was perfectly tailored. Every step radiated confidence and authority. People automatically moved out of her path. Some greeted her, others simply watched. She acknowledged none of them. Without looking at John, she slid into the rear seat. "Federal Street Conference Center," she said. "I'm already late." That was all. The door closed. The SUV pulled into traffic. John focused on the road while Claire continued a conversation through her wireless headset. At first, he paid little attention. Professional drivers learned how to hear without listening. But then a few words caught his attention. Japanese, technical Japanese. His eyes flickered toward the rearview mirror. Claire was discussing specifications for the Takahashi contract. Several times she hesitated. Several times she used terms incorrectly. The mistakes were subtle, almost invisible. The kind of errors that most Americans would never notice. But John noticed every single one. A phrase describing alloy composition was confused with structural composition. A liability term was translated too broadly. A technical specification carried a meaning slightly different from what the Japanese side intended. Individually, none of the mistakes seemed dangerous. Together, they formed a problem. A very expensive problem. John remained silent. He had spent years training himself to remain silent. After all, who would listen to a driver? In the back seat, Claire finished the call and rubbed her temples. The pressure surrounding the Takahashi deal had become overwhelming. For 4 months, she had personally negotiated every stage of the agreement. If successful, the contract would bring $9 million in immediate revenue and open the door to Asian markets worth many times that amount. Failure wasn't an option. At least that's what she kept telling herself. By noon, they arrived at the conference center. Before stepping out, Claire checked her reflection in the window. Everything looked perfect, professional, confident, unshakable. Yet beneath that image, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to admit. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of disappointing everyone who believed she wasn't capable of leading the company. Ever since inheriting Ashford Industries from her father, she had been fighting the same battle. Too young, too inexperienced, too emotional, too ambitious. Every board meeting felt like a test. Every contract felt like a referendum on her leadership. Every mistake became evidence for people waiting to see her fail. As she entered the conference room, 11 directors rose from their seats. Among them sat Marcus Reed, Chief Operating Officer, trusted advisor, company veteran. At least on the surface, Marcus greeted her with his usual professional smile. "Morning, Claire." "Morning." The meeting began. Charts appeared on screens. Revenue projections filled the room. Lawyers reviewed contract language. Financial advisors discussed market opportunities. Everything seemed normal. Yet Marcus spent much of the meeting emphasizing potential risks. "The Takahashi Group has a reputation for changing direction," he said. "We should prepare alternatives." "Such as?" Claire asked. Marcus folded his hands. "Brennan Alloy." The name immediately caught her attention. Brennan Alloy was a direct competitor. Smaller, less established. But somehow, Marcus continued recommending them whenever major contracts appeared. Claire didn't like it. She never had. Still, she lacked evidence to challenge him. "Thank you for your concern," she replied. "But our focus remains the Takahashi agreement." Several directors exchanged glances. No one argued. The meeting moved on. Meanwhile, outside the tower, John waited inside the parked SUV. Hours passed. Executives came and went. Delivery trucks arrived. Employees hurried across the plaza. Most of it meant nothing. Then something unusual happened. A man wearing a charcoal overcoat approached the loading area behind the building. Another man emerged from a side entrance. Marcus Reed. John watched carefully. The two men exchanged a brief conversation. Then the visitor handed Marcus a thin envelope. No handshake, no smiles. Just a quick exchange before both men disappeared. To anyone else, it would have seemed unimportant. To John, it looked wrong. Very wrong. He didn't know exactly why, but experience had taught him something valuable. People rarely risk secrecy when conducting honest business. He memorized the man's face, the way he walked, the car he entered, the license plate, small details, tiny pieces of a puzzle. Then he returned his attention to the street. Years ago, he would have investigated immediately. Years ago, he would have called contacts, gathered information, and uncovered the truth within hours. But that life belonged to another man. A man he had left behind, or at least tried to. As evening approached, Claire finally returned to the SUV. She looked exhausted. "Hotel Four Seasons," she said. "Private reception." John nodded. The Takahashi delegation had arrived in Boston. Tonight's reception would be the final step before the signing ceremony. Everything depended on making the right impression. Neither Claire nor anyone else inside Ashford Industries realized that forces were already moving against them. Someone had begun setting a trap. A trap designed to destroy the contract. A trap designed to destroy Claire's reputation. And unless someone discovered the truth soon, $9 million would be only the beginning of what Ashford Industries was about to lose. Before the night was over, John Bennett would witness something that would convince him this was no accident. Someone was sabotaging the deal, and for the first time in 8 years, the quiet driver would be forced to decide whether to remain invisible or step back into a world he had sworn never to enter again. If you're enjoying this story, hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next surprises. Because in the next chapter, a handkerchief, a public mockery, and a secret buried for 8 years will begin to change everyone's fate. 3 nights later, Boston disappeared beneath a curtain of rain. Water streamed down the glass walls of the Four Seasons Hotel as luxury cars lined up beneath the entrance canopy. Inside, the rooftop ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and the quiet confidence of people accustomed to wealth. Tonight was important, very important. The Takahashi delegation had officially arrived from Japan. If everything went according to plan, the final contract would be signed within days. For Claire Ashford, this reception wasn't merely a social gathering. It was a test. Every conversation, every handshake, every detail mattered. Failure was not an option. As guests filled the ballroom, Claire moved gracefully through the crowd, greeting executives, investors, and international partners. She smiled when necessary. She listened carefully. She projected confidence. But beneath the polished exterior, pressure weighed heavily on her shoulders. Across the room stood Hiroshi Takahashi himself, the legendary chairman whose approval could transform Ashford Industries forever. Every director on Claire's board knew it. Every investor knew it. And unfortunately, so did the people hoping she would fail. Meanwhile, John Bennett remained where drivers were expected to remain, invisibly. A hotel manager had directed him to wait near a side corridor outside the ballroom. John didn't mind. He had spent years being overlooked. In many ways, it made life easier. From his position, however, he could observe nearly everything happening inside, and what he saw troubled him. Marcus Reed seemed unusually relaxed, almost too relaxed. Instead of focusing on the Takahashi delegation, he spent much of the evening speaking privately with several investors. Each conversation ended with the same subtle expression, a satisfied smile, the smile of a man expecting something good to happen. John filed the observation away. Then disaster struck. One careless moment changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Edward Hollis, one of Ashford Industries' largest shareholders, had consumed far too much wine. As he turned during a conversation, his arm swung outward. The glass tipped. Red wine splashed across the front of Claire's white dress. The room froze. Conversation stopped. Several guests looked away. Others stared openly. The dark stain spread across the fabric like an ugly wound. For a brief second, Claire stood motionless. Embarrassment flushed across her face. Then a quiet figure stepped forward. John. Without hesitation, he crossed the room carrying a neatly folded white handkerchief. His movements were calm, natural, respectful. "Ma'am," he said softly, extending it toward her. Before Claire could respond, laughter echoed through the ballroom. Edward Hollis looked at John and smirked. "Well, that's unusual." More laughter followed. Hollis raised his glass. "Drivers don't usually carry handkerchiefs." The crowd chuckled. Then came the next comment. Crueler, louder. "Did your wife teach you that trick?" Several people laughed again. Others shifted uncomfortably. John's expression never changed. He simply stood there holding the handkerchief. Then Marcus Reed stepped forward. His smile was polished, calculated, dangerous. "Let the help know his place, Claire." The room became quiet. Very quiet. "We don't pay him to pretend he's a gentleman." A few nervous laughs followed. Most people looked down. Nobody wanted to challenge a senior executive. Nobody wanted attention, especially not from Marcus Reed. For a long moment, John said nothing. His face revealed no anger, no embarrassment, no resentment. Instead, he calmly placed the handkerchief on a nearby table. Then he stepped backward. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, returning to the edge of the room. Invisible once again, Claire watched him. Something felt wrong. Not with John, with everyone else. Most people who were publicly humiliated showed it. They reacted, defended themselves, walked away angry. John did none of those things. His composure was unsettling, almost impossible. Then her eyes drifted toward the handkerchief. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, but when she picked it up, she noticed details. The fabric wasn't ordinary cotton. It was Italian silk. The stitching was handmade, and in one corner rested a small embroidered letter, J. This wasn't the possession of an average driver, not even close. A strange feeling settled into her mind. For the first time, she began wondering whether John Bennett was really who he claimed to be. Across the room, John continued observing the guests, but internally, old memories had awakened. Memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. There had been a time when men like Hollis and Marcus would never have spoken to him that way. A time when executives had waited outside his office. A time when international business leaders knew his name. But that life was gone. He had made his choice years ago, and despite everything, he had never regretted it. Still, as he watched Marcus laugh with several investors, a warning stirred inside him. Something was coming, something bigger than a spilled glass of wine. Someone was positioning pieces on a board, and the target wasn't him. It was Claire Ashford. The reception continued. The music played, champagne flowed, but hidden beneath the elegant atmosphere, a storm was already gathering. A storm that would soon threaten a $9 million deal and expose a betrayal no one inside that ballroom saw coming. The morning after the reception arrived, cold and clear. Boston's streets still glistened from the previous night's rain as John Bennett pulled the SUV away from the curb outside Claire Ashford's townhouse. Neither of them mentioned what had happened at the hotel. Neither mentioned the wine, the laughter, or the handkerchief, yet the memory lingered between them. Claire sat quietly in the back seat reviewing documents for the Takahashi contract. Several sections had been marked with red notes from translators and legal advisors. The closer the signing date approached, the more nervous she became. $9 million. Months of negotiations. Hundreds of hours of preparation. Everything depended on getting every detail right. As she flipped through the pages, one paragraph caught her attention. A translator had highlighted a technical phrase and suggested a revision. Claire frowned. Something about it didn't feel right. She read it again. Then, a calm voice broke the silence. It shouldn't be translated that way. Claire looked up immediately. John's eyes remained on the road. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. What? John hesitated. Perhaps he had already said too much. But it was too late now. The translator's note is incorrect, he said quietly. The Japanese wording refers to yield strength liability, not load capacity liability. Claire blinked. The terms sounded similar, but legally they were completely different. How do you know that? John remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he answered, because that's how Japanese steel contracts are written. Claire stared at the back of his head. A strange feeling spread through her chest. Most executives in America wouldn't know that distinction. Yet somehow her driver did. She glanced back at the contract. What difference does it make? John answered immediately. If the translation is wrong, Ashford Industries could become responsible for failures caused by suppliers you don't control. The SUV became silent again. This time, however, the silence felt different. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't speculating. He knew exactly what he was talking about. The confidence in his voice made that obvious. "Pull over," Claire suddenly said. John obeyed. The SUV rolled smoothly toward the curb. The engine continued running. For the first time since hiring him, Claire leaned forward. "Who are you?" John almost smiled, not because the question surprised him, because he had known this moment would eventually come. "Et-tu?" "No." Her voice sharpened. "You don't speak like a driver." John said nothing. "You understand Japanese business law." Silence. "You understand steel contracts." More silence. "You recognize translation mistakes that my consultants missed." Still nothing. Claire folded her arms. "Try again." For a brief moment, John considered telling her everything. The boardrooms, the negotiations, the international contracts, the life he had left behind. Instead, he gave the simplest answer. "I've spent a lot of years reading contracts." Claire studied him through the mirror. The response wasn't technically a lie, but it certainly wasn't the truth. Eventually, she sighed. "Fine." John restarted the car and merged back into traffic. The conversation ended, at least on the surface. Inside her mind, however, questions multiplied. By the time they reached Ashford Industries headquarters, curiosity had become suspicion. The moment she entered her office, she called her assistant. "Diane." "Yes, Miss Ashford, I need information." "About what?" "About someone." Diane immediately recognized the tone. This wasn't a casual request. "Who?" "John Bennett." A pause followed. "The driver?" "Everything you can find. Employment history, education, references, previous employers. Everything." Diane nodded. "I'll start immediately." The investigation took less than 3 hours. The results raised even more questions. At first glance, John's file appeared completely ordinary. Age, 38. Employment, Elite Drive Services. Driving record, spotless. Criminal history, none. Financial history, clean. Education, not listed. Previous employment, unavailable. Claire read the file twice, then a third time. Nothing made sense. A man with John's knowledge should have had a substantial professional history. Instead, there was almost nothing. It was as if 8 years of his life had simply vanished. She leaned back in her chair. "Diane." "Yes? Does this seem strange to you?" Diane nodded immediately. "Very. There's almost nothing here." "Exactly." The older woman lowered her voice. "People usually leave footprints." "What kind of footprints?" "Jobs, promotions, business licenses, professional memberships." She tapped the folder. "This man seems to have appeared from nowhere." Claire looked out the office window. Far below, the city moved through its usual routine. Cars, pedestrians, construction crews, thousands of ordinary lives. And somewhere among them sat a man driving her company vehicle. A man who knew more about international steel contracts than some of her executives. a man whose past appeared to have been deliberately erased. That evening, after returning home, Claire replayed the conversation in her mind. Again and again, she remembered the confidence in John's voice, the certainty, the precision. Those weren't the words of someone who had merely read a few articles online. Those were the words of an expert. Meanwhile, across the city, John sat beside his daughter at the kitchen table. Sophie was reading aloud from a school book. Every few sentences, she stumbled over a difficult word. Every time she did, John patiently helped her. No frustration, no hurry, no distractions. To Sophie, he wasn't a mysterious businessman, or a former executive, or an expert negotiator. He was simply Dad, the most important title he had ever held. After she went to bed, John stood alone in the kitchen. The apartment was quiet. He opened a locked drawer and removed an old business card. The edges had faded with time, yet the name remained clear. Hiroshi Takahashi, Chairman, Takahashi Group. John stared at it for a long moment. Memories surfaced. Old meetings, old promises, old friendships. Then he returned the card to the drawer and locked it away. Because if fate continued moving in the direction he feared, that past would not remain buried much longer. And when the truth finally emerged, it would change everything Claire Ashford believed about the quiet driver sitting behind the wheel of her SUV. Tuesday arrived faster than anyone expected. For Claire Ashford, the day represented the culmination of 4 months of negotiations, countless meetings, and more pressure than she cared to admit. Everything had led to this moment. At 10 o'clock that morning, the final signing ceremony with the Takahashi Group would take place. By noon, Ashford Industries could be celebrating the largest international contract in company history, or watching it disappear. As the city slowly awakened, Claire stood in front of the mirror inside her apartment. She adjusted the sleeve of her navy blue suit. Simple, professional, confident. At least that was the image she wanted the world to see. Inside, however, she felt uneasy. The strange conversation with John Bennett continued to replay in her mind. The translator's mistake, his knowledge of contract law, the mysterious gaps in his background, none of it made sense. And somehow, that bothered her more than the contract itself. At exactly 8:45, she stepped outside. The SUV was waiting. John stood beside the driver's door. As always, he said very little. "Good morning, ma'am." "Morning." She climbed into the back seat and opened her laptop. The drive toward downtown Boston began quietly. For nearly 20 minutes, neither spoke. Then Claire's phone rang. The screen showed Diane's name. Immediately, she answered, "Diane?" The voice on the other end sounded tense. Very tense. "Claire, we have a serious problem." Claire's stomach tightened. What happened? There was a change made to the contract. What kind of change? A new liability clause. The words instantly captured her attention. "What are you talking about?" Diane took a breath. "I reviewed the final digital copy this morning, and someone inserted additional language into Section 6. Claire sat upright. Her pulse accelerated. How serious? Several seconds passed. Then Diane answered, "Potentially catastrophic." The SUV suddenly felt smaller. What does the clause do? It transfers unlimited liability to Ashford Industries for material defects. Claire froze. Unlimited liability? That was impossible. No competent executive would ever agree to such a provision. "No." Her voice dropped. "No, that's not in the approved version." "I know." Diane sounded frightened now. "I compared it against last week's draft. It wasn't there." Claire's mind raced. Who had access? Who could modify the document? Only a handful of people. And one name immediately appeared in her thoughts. Marcus Reed. She didn't want to believe it, yet she couldn't ignore the possibility. Who accessed the system? 3 authorized users, which are you, me, and Marcus. The SUV became silent. Even traffic noise seemed distant. Finally, Claire spoke. "Print everything. The original version, the modified version, the system logs, every timestamp. Understood?" "And Diane?" "Yes. Don't tell Marcus." A pause. Then a quiet answer. "I won't." The call ended. Claire lowered the phone slowly. Her reflection stared back from the dark window. For the first time in years, she felt genuinely afraid. Across the front seat, John had heard every word. He remained focused on the road. Yet his expression grew noticeably harder. The trap had already been sprung. The only question now was whether they were too late. An hour later, the SUV arrived at the Takahashi Group's American headquarters. The signing ceremony was ready. Lawyers waited. Photographers waited. Executives waited. Everything appeared perfect. Everything except the contract. Inside the conference room, Hiroshi Takahashi greeted Claire politely. The chairman's calm demeanor offered no clue about what was about to happen. The delegates sat. The documents were distributed. The room fell quiet. Everyone watched. Takahashi began reading, slowly, carefully, methodically. Years of experience had taught him patience. Every page received his full attention. Every paragraph, every sentence, every word. Minutes passed. No one spoke. Then he reached section 6. His eyes stopped moving. The room remained silent. He read the paragraph once, then again, then a third time. Finally, he placed the contract on the table. The sound echoed through the room. Small, soft, devastating. "Miss Ashford." His voice remained respectful, yet something had changed. "We cannot sign today." The words struck like a hammer. Several attorneys exchanged worried looks. Claire felt her throat tighten. "Mr. Takahashi." The chairman gently raised a hand. "This language was not part of our agreement." He tapped the page. "Someone has altered the contract." The room froze. "I do not know why. I do not know who, but I cannot place my company's future beneath terms that were never discussed." Every word felt heavier than the last. "We must reconsider this partnership." The sentence landed like a final verdict. For 4 months, Claire had fought for this agreement. Now, it was disappearing before her eyes, and she could do nothing to stop it. Takahashi stood. The delegation stood with him. The meeting ended, just like that. 15 minutes. 4 months. Destroyed. In 15 minutes. The doors closed behind the Japanese executives. Silence filled the conference room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Claire remained seated. The unsigned contract lay before her, mocking her, a reminder of failure. Outside the building, John waited beside the SUV. As he scanned the parking area, a familiar face appeared. Marcus Reed. He exited the building smiling. Not relieved. Not disappointed. Satisfied. Beside him walked the same mysterious Asian man John had seen days earlier near Ashford Industries. The two exchanged a few quiet words. Then the stranger entered a black sedan and drove away. Marcus watched the car disappear before turning back toward the building. The expression on his face confirmed everything John needed to know. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was sabotage. Deliberate, planned, and extremely expensive. Several minutes later, Claire emerged from the elevator. The confidence that usually surrounded her was gone. Her shoulders slumped. Her face looked pale, exhausted, defeated. She climbed into the back seat without speaking. Then she called Diane. The moment the line connected, her voice broke. "What?" She listened, her eyes closed. Then came the confirmation she had feared. The deal is officially canceled. $9 million. Gone. The phone slipped into her lap. For a long moment, neither she nor John spoke. Traffic moved around them. People walked along the sidewalks. Life continued normally for everyone else. But inside that SUV, everything had changed. Finally, Claire stared out the window. "I spent 10 years building this company." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. 10 years. The pain behind those words was impossible to miss. She wasn't talking about money. She wasn't talking about prestige. She was talking about trust, reputation, legacy, the fear that every critic had been right about her. For several seconds, John said nothing. Then, something happened that had never happened before. He pulled the SUV to the curb, turned off the engine, and turned around to face her. For the first time since becoming her driver, he looked directly into her eyes. His expression was calm, steady. "Certain, Miss Ashford," he said quietly. "The deal isn't dead yet." Claire looked up, confused. Hope and disbelief collided inside her. "What?" John held her gaze. "The contract didn't fail because of negotiation. It failed because someone wanted it to fail." A long silence followed. Then, he spoke the words that would change everything. "If you trust me, I know how to get Mr. Takahashi back to the table." And for the first time since the disaster began, Claire Ashford felt something she thought she had lost forever that morning. Hope. The drive to Beacon Hill passed in silence. Boston's evening lights reflected across the windshield as the SUV climbed the narrow historic streets toward Mount Vernon Street. Claire Ashford sat in the back seat, clutching the folder Diane had delivered minutes earlier. Inside were the documents, the original contract, the altered contract, the system logs, proof that someone had tampered with the agreement. Yet even now, one question troubled her more than all the others. Who exactly was John Bennett? Every answer seemed to create 3 new questions. How did he know so much about the Takahashi group? How did he know where Hiroshi Takahashi was staying? How did he understand Japanese contract law better than her own consultants? And why had he spent 8 years driving a car when he clearly belonged somewhere else? The SUV stopped outside a narrow brick townhouse. Warm light glowed behind the windows. The neighborhood was quiet, private, esclusive, the kind of place where powerful people disappeared from public view. John stepped out first. For the first time since Claire had met him, she noticed something unusual. He looked nervous, not frightened, not uncertain, just hesitant, like a man standing outside a door connected to a life he thought he had left behind forever. Together, they climbed the steps. John raised his hand, knocked once. The door opened. An elderly Japanese man appeared. Hiroshi Takahashi. The chairman looked first at Claire. Recognition flashed across his face. Then his eyes shifted past her. To John. Everything changed. The older man's expression froze. For several seconds neither spoke. The silence felt almost unreal. Then Takahashi whispered something in Japanese. A single sentence. His voice carried disbelief, emotion, and perhaps even relief. John lowered his head respectfully. Then he answered in fluent Japanese. Not basic Japanese. Not conversational Japanese. Fluent, natural, effortless. The language flowed from him as if he had spoken it his entire life. Claire stood frozen. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood enough. The 2 men clearly knew each other, and not casually. Something much deeper connected them. Finally, Takahashi stepped aside. "Please," he said quietly, "come inside." The living room felt warm and welcoming. A fire crackled softly in the corner. Tea had already been prepared. The atmosphere felt less like a business meeting and more like a reunion. For several moments, no one discussed the contract. No one mentioned the deal. Instead, Takahashi simply looked at John, as if trying to confirm he was truly there. Finally, the chairman turned toward Claire. "Miss Ashford," he said, "do you know who this man is?" Claire glanced at John, then back at Takahashi. "He's my driver." The words sounded ridiculous the moment they left her mouth. Takahashi smiled sadly. "No," he shook his head. "He is much more than that." The room became silent. 10 years ago, Takahashi began, his voice calm and reflective. "My company was very small in America. We had no reputation, no major partners, no influence. Most executives wouldn't even meet with us." He looked toward John. "Except one." Claire listened carefully. "One young executive spent 3 days helping me understand the American market. He reviewed contracts. He solved technical problems. He negotiated our first major supply agreement. He treated me with respect when no one else would." Takahashi paused. A faint smile appeared. That young executive was John Bennett. Claire stared. The words didn't seem real. "Executive? John? The quiet driver?" The man who spent his mornings taking his daughter to school? The chairman continued. The first successful American contract my company ever signed was written by him. The international relationships that followed were built on that foundation. I trusted American business because of him. The room fell silent again. Claire slowly turned toward John. Is that true? John met her eyes. For the first time, there was no reason to hide. Yes. The answer came quietly. No pride, no arrogance, just truth. But why? The question escaped before she could stop herself. Why leave all of that? John looked toward the fire. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke. Because 8 years ago, my wife became sick. His voice remained steady, but the pain beneath it was impossible to miss. The treatments became more frequent. The hospital visits became longer. My daughter needed me. He paused. My wife needed me. The room remained perfectly still. I had a choice. A career or my family. His eyes lowered briefly. I chose my family. Claire felt her throat tighten. No dramatic speech. No heroic declaration. Just a simple decision. One made by a husband and father. A decision that had cost him everything professionally. Yet somehow, he didn't seem to regret it. Takahashi nodded slowly. Most people spend their lives chasing success. John walked away from it. The chairman's voice softened. And that is why I never forgot him. Claire looked at the man she thought she knew. The man she had hired as a driver. The man others had mocked. The man Marcus had publicly humiliated. And suddenly, everything made sense. The contract language, the technical knowledge, the confidence, the dignity. John Bennett had never been an ordinary driver. He had simply been a remarkable man living an ordinary life. Takahashi finally looked toward the folder in Claire's hands. The contract, he said. I believe there is something you wish to show me. Claire nodded. Slowly, carefully, she placed the evidence on the table. And at that moment, the real battle began. Because before the night ended, the truth behind the sabotage would be exposed. And before the next sunrise, an entire boardroom would discover that the most important person in Ashford Industries was never the CEO. It was the man they thought was only the driver. The weeks that followed changed Ashford Industries forever. The investigation uncovered everything. Marcus Reed's secret communications, the hidden offshore company, the financial trail linking him to competitors who stood to profit from Ashford's failure. What began as the sabotage of a single contract quickly exposed years of corruption buried beneath the surface. Within days, Marcus was gone. Within weeks, legal proceedings had begun. And within months, Ashford Industries emerged stronger than it had been before. The $9 million Takahashi contract moved forward exactly as originally planned. But for Claire Ashford, the most valuable thing she gained wasn't the contract. It was perspective. For years, she had measured people by titles, by resumes, by positions, by appearances. She believed success could be identified by what someone owned or where they sat in the corporate hierarchy. Then she met John Bennett, a man who drove her to meetings, opened doors, waited quietly in parking lots, and never once mentioned the extraordinary life he had left behind. Not because he was ashamed of it, because it no longer defined him. One snowy Saturday evening, Claire invited John and Sophie to dinner at her home. There were no contracts, no board members, no investors, just 3 people sharing a simple meal. Sophie talked excitedly about school. John listened with the patient smile of a father who understood how quickly childhood passes. And for the first time in many years, Claire found herself laughing without thinking about work, without thinking about deadlines, without thinking about proving herself. When dinner ended, Sophie handed Claire a drawing. In the picture stood 3 figures, a father, a daughter, and a woman standing beside them. Above them floated soft clouds and a bright sky. Claire felt her eyes fill with tears, not because of the drawing, because she finally understood something. Success wasn't measured only by contracts worth millions of dollars. It wasn't measured by stock prices, board votes, or executive titles. Sometimes success was much simpler. A father reading bedtime stories, a daughter who felt safe, a promise kept, a family protected. John Bennett had walked away from a fortune years ago, yet somehow he had become richer than most people would ever understand. As snow settled quietly outside the windows, the future no longer felt uncertain. For the first time in a long while, it felt hopeful. And somewhere nearby, a little girl was already drawing the next chapter of their story. Perhaps the greatest victories are not the ones won in boardrooms. Perhaps they are the ones won at home. The end. Before you go, if this story touched your heart, take a moment to tell us, what would you have chosen an extraordinary career or precious time with your family? Share your answer in the comments below. We read every single one. Like this video if you believe integrity still matters. Leave a comment if John Bennett's journey inspired you. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next emotional and inspiring story. And remember, many people spend their lives chasing success, but the people who truly change the world are often the ones who quietly choose what matters most. Next on this channel, don't leave just yet. In the next story, you'll meet a single father who was publicly fired by a billionaire CEO in front of hundreds of employees, only for a shocking secret from his past to return and change everyone's lives forever. Click the next video on your screen now and continue your journey with us, because the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us what it truly means to be human.